Hi, I'm Ivey-Cone, and this is Fuki Cafe. This is actually Fuki Cafe number 9, number 9, number 9, in honor of Fukushima and the implications of that radiation, the implications of nuclear reactors all around the planet. Over a year ago, Fukushima just was this constant backdrop to everything else going on in my life, and I realized that really Fukushima had changed everything for planet Earth. Not too many people knew about it or noticed it or paid much attention, and there certainly was a huge blackout in the media on the topic. That's changing, but not in time for some of the very important steps that could have been taken earlier on. So about a year and a half ago, as I'm fidgeting about Fukushima, I decided to start the show, and that's how Fuki Cafe came into being. Now, Fukushima is not spelled with an I, but it was an early mutation. We're going to start today's show with a clip that was produced by one Isao Hashimoto. It tracks the nuclear testing that was done from 1948 until 1998. Some additional countries have done some nuclear activity since then, but this is a pretty good synopsis of what happened. There are only beeps and visuals. So here we go. And when we come back from this clip, we'll be joined by my guest today, Martin Webb. But in the meantime, let's see just how much radiation we've already been exposed to. Rather astonishing how much radiation the planet has already been subjected to. If you happen to notice at the end, the largest white dot, which shows accumulation, is on the west coast of North America. The west coast of North America is what is about to have the entire brunt of Fukushima land on it. With me here is Martin Webb, my guest for today, and we're going to get into some conversations. Martin, thanks for being on the show.
Thanks for inviting me and having the show.
Well, it's interesting how you ended up being here. In preparing for the show, I had really thought I needed somebody who knew something about the Fukushima situation, which I've been tracking through various radio shows I listen to. And there you were on the radio, not an unusual place for you to be,
No.
talking about Fukushima. And I drove straight to the station and said, will you please be on the show?
Who is this person waiting in the lobby for me after the show, I'm thinking. Yeah, I've been involved in renewable energy for the last 15 years, primarily solar electric. But for the last 8 years, I've been producing a monthly radio show on KVMR here in Northern California called The Energy Report. And that came about because in the 2004 presidential elections, I was very disappointed during the debates that there was no discussion about energy or the environment at that time. Mm-hmm. And most of the energy-related news was buried deep in the business pages, actually. And a lot of times I'd be looking in the Sacramento Bee, and back in the business section was info about oil, natural gas, nuclear power. And I really realized the public wasn't getting the full grasp of this. And while today the public has a lot of resources for energy news, and a lot of people have certainly heard of Fukushima, I still feel compelled to every month have a 1-hour radio show where all the most interesting information is disseminated to people so they're aware of the impacts, the implications of our energy choices, how it's consumed, how it's produced, how it's distributed. And so naturally, with the dangers associated with Fukushima and the damaged reactors there, I'm finding that being a more common topic on my show. But yeah, really recently I finally became seriously aware of some of the dangers beyond just the water that people are aware of. So I'm really pleased that we're having an opportunity to really spread the news, but hopefully we can provide some balance so that people are aware of the problem. But I want to preface it by saying I'm not a nuclear engineer. I don't have any degrees related to nuclear technology. I've just been involved in renewable energy and tracking energy-related topics for a decade or more now.
Well, and over this last decade, we have, had much more open recognition of peak oil and all of the, ramifications associated with that. Guy McPherson, Mike Ruppert, Carolyn Baker, all of whom are going to be here today in clips from their radio shows. Mm-hmm. Helen Caldicott, we have a clip from her as well. But principally McPherson and Ruppert and Baker have been talking about the demise of industrial civilization, that it is not sustainable in any form. And you know as well as I do that you can't go out and find renewable sources of energy that even come close to matching the density of the oil. So that was kind of my main event for quite a while over this last decade. Climate chaos, industrial civilization being unsustainable and beginning to crumble and collapse, as we see. Mm-hmm. And Guy McPherson is a professor of natural resources, professor emeritus of natural resources and environment at the University of Arizona. He's written a number of books and has been compiling data on the positive feedback loops that climate chaos has now triggered. And in the last 6 months, 9 more roughly have been added. So we have 19 now reinforcing feedback loops that have tipped over. They're not fixable. So for me, that was like the main event until Fukushima. And they've been kind of, doing
dancing
this,
partners.
Dancing partners, exactly. Because either one of them is portending near-term human extinction. Mm-hmm. And that's a hard thing to be saying out loud.
It very much can come across as a Chicken Little type of thing, and I think over the last decade or so, even starting with Y2K, I first got into the solar industry in 1998, And at that time, everyone was really worried about Y2K and some sort of collapse because of computers. And since then, we've seen repeated challenges on a planetary scale that didn't necessarily manifest, and I think people are getting fatigued hearing about now it's this threat, now it's that threat. Everyone's ready to just go back to shopping and consuming, and I haven't seen anything happen yet, so stop with all of the chirping of negative things. But Fukushima is definitely different, and it's odd for the public to be so aware of the tsunami, the earthquake, the damage to the reactor. But there seems to be an odd silence about the fuel rods and some of the risks that we're about to experience within the next few weeks.
Exactly, within the next few weeks. And we're going to hear a lot more about that, actually, as we proceed through the show. So for my viewers out there, I'm going to bring in a clip now of Guy McPherson as he appeared on Mike Ruppert's Lifeboat Hour, which is on the web at prn.fm, and Mike Ruppert's Lifeboat Hour. So here we're going to take a listen to Mike and Guy McPherson. And this clip was actually done on a show August, well, you'll see the date. It's going to come up at the head of this clip. Let's take a look.
Clear statements from very respected nuclear scientists like Arne Gunderson, like Chris Busby, and like Helen Caldicott, that what is of concern also now to all of them is the fact that this massive flow of groundwater flowing off a mountainside underneath, and now to which is added the enormous pumping of water to try to keep what they can keep cool, especially two sets of fuel rods, MOX fuel rods stored on top of buildings 3 and 4 cool, which is probably where most of the contamination is coming from. But it's actually undermining buildings 3 and 4, and I was, I've been aware of this for a long time, but Arne Gunderson himself raised the statement this week, the possibility this week that we could be looking at the collapse of building 3 or 4, which would expose 20-plus years of spent fuel rods to open-air fusion reaction. This is a total game changer, isn't it, Guy?
Absolutely. If any of those are MOX, and I assume they are,
yes,
then it's an unmitigated disaster that could very well lead to the loss of a huge number of human lives in the very short term.
I recall Arne Gunderson in the first weeks, perhaps first 2 months after the earthquake and tsunami, saying that no one has ever conceived what an open-air, uncontrolled fusion reaction of that amount of fuel would do. And even he, I believe at that time, said, it could be enough to set the atmosphere on fire, absolutely unknown consequences. But I was going to play a video, an audio clip of Helen Caldicott, which I somehow lost out on my script and didn't have time to go refine again. But this brings to mind a very important question for you, which I totally know that you are competent to answer. Those amounts of becquerels of radiation pouring into the Pacific Ocean now for 2 years already will have unmitigated impact on the food chain and life in the Pacific Ocean. Can you perhaps talk to us about that?
Well, it's the world's biggest ocean, and the marine food chain, marine systems, account for about half of the food humans currently eat. It appears extremely likely at this point that it's not an if, but a given, that there is considerable contamination. In fact, I keep seeing news reports of every item that's tested, every piece of tuna, every piece of salmon, and so on that's tested is off the charts in terms of contamination and being unsafe for human consumption.
Mark from Minneapolis, are you there?
Yeah, Mike, thanks for doing my call. I'm always astonished that whenever I have these conversations, so many people are unaware. But my question about Fukushima is, if we're in uncharted territories with a full-on China syndrome meltdown, we have no idea what's going to happen. This could definitely be an extinction event, could it not?
Guy, you first.
Absolutely. I can't see how we can avoid this being an extinction event, if not on its own, then in concert with climate change or the meltdown of numerous other nuclear power plants, more or less simultaneously.
Mm-hmm.
This is a big, big deal. If there's MOX fuel and it's exposed to the air, a few micrograms of MOX floating around the air and ending up in your lungs has you dead in a matter of weeks.
And we are talking about, in both buildings 3 and 4, fuel storage pools. I know 4 has more than 20 years of accumulated fuel rods. The amounts, we are talking of tens and perhaps hundreds of tons of MOX fuel that might open air incinerate. Those numbers are incomprehensible.
Right, and so then it gets taken up in the atmosphere and falls down as rain all over the world, and we're all radiated.
We're toast, yes. And it would follow this now highly meandering, erratic, would you call it spasmodic jet stream?
Yes, and Jennifer Francis at Rutgers has done a great job describing how that came about and what the consequences are on the climate front. But yes, that meandering jet stream is going to take this, just general circulation patterns, going to take this incredibly lethal ionizing radiation throughout the globe in an astonishingly short period of time.
We saw, and I wrote about this at CollapseNet when I was there. I gave a speech in Portland, Oregon, 9/11/11, in which I warned about this because it was documented then that when there was a large venting, the Japanese were actually incinerating radioactive waste, and it saw Geiger counters spiking horrendously in Toronto, where it's like a log scale guy, I believe, where you're at one level on a Geiger, and then you click, and the next level is 10 times greater, the next level is 10 times greater than that. And so we know that that's the way it's distributed, and that is what we have to fear. Very clearly, it is my opinion and my belief that if Building 3 or Building 4 goes down, first of all, nobody will be able to come within 15 miles of the reactors, all of them, so they will all go. But if either one topples over, it's entirely possible, and I've heard somebody else say this, the West Coast could be uninhabitable, or wherever the jet stream goes, within a matter of days or weeks.
That's going to be inconvenient. We should have been taking this seriously a long time ago, and because it takes at least 2 decades to safely decommission a nuclear power plant. We have now well over 400 of them, and nobody's interested in starting the process of decommissioning any of them.
Right. Well, San Onofre was a lucky stroke week, but there's not counting the reactors in naval vessels around the world, those in government labs. There are 440, 450 commercial reactors on the planet, and many of them are already rickety as hell anyway.
450, give or take, and almost all of them are, as Mike put it, rickety as hell. So, Martin?
It's scary. Yeah, it's scary, and unfortunately, I think the last decade or two has really seen a lack of confidence in the public's eye for regulators, for governments, for utilities to really take care of our safety. And I think that's what we're seeing now is people are not sure exactly how this is going to turn out. And unfortunately, what seems to be occurring is everyone's letting TEPCO, the Tokyo utility, deal with the problem. But this is something that is affecting our water quality potentially. It definitely could affect the air quality. And as they pointed out, what we really have is a situation that is very delicate because all of the fuel rods that could come in contact with each other or could create a fire and a nuclear type of explosion, all of those are sitting on buildings that are teetering, are being held up by jacks, and scientists have said there's a 98% chance that there will be a 7.0 earthquake there at Fukushima within the next 3 years. So we can't just sit because the Earth may decide for us. And matter of fact, here it is at the end of September, and we just had a 5.3 earthquake just days ago underneath Fukushima, and they say that nothing happened as far as worsening the situation there, but
other
it's just
than
a reminder.
Other than the fact that, as one of these guys, one of these clips mentions, it might be Helen Caldicott actually, that those sites are literally liquefied mud. It is completely unstable, and reactor 3 is apparently sinking in an uneven way, which I think you actually mentioned in the clip of you that we're going to play a little bit later. Yeah, very scary. TEPCO is completely unqualified. Helen Caldicott, for years since this has occurred, has been, really championing the notion of getting real scientists, real, well-informed engineers on the task. And what's happened at this point is that it is because of the full meltdown that's occurred, possibly in two of the reactors. It is so radioactive that people can't even get in there. The robotics will not work. The cranes that were there were completely destroyed during the tsunami.
The scale of destruction, I think, escapes most people, that has actually made this whole task far more difficult.
Almost impossible.
Normally they're computer-guided cranes that are moving all of these spent fuel rods around very carefully, and in this case all of that equipment's been damaged, and they're going to have to construct cranes on site, but workers will have to do short shifts because of the radioactivity. So just an unprecedented challenge. We really can't do anything but hope that humanity can address this before an earthquake does on our behalf. So.
Right. The total number between the 4 reactors of active fuel rods as well as the spent fuel rods, which incidentally are on top of the reactors now.
100 feet up in the air.
And they base that on the design for the nuclear submarines. And it made sense to put those cooling tanks on the top of a submarine. Does not make good sense to put them on top of a building, right? But there are over 6,000 of these that now have to be handled under human control, not precise robotic control, which is a perfect lead-in to the next clip I'd like to share.
Okay.
So the next clip that we have coming up here is going to be Helen Caldicott, actually on Mike Ruppert's Lifeboat Hour. And it's got some really interesting edges. So let's go ahead and take a look at that.
We are all blessed to have you with us, Dr. Helen Caldicott from down under in Australia. Welcome to the Lifeboat Hour.
Thank you very much.
I started off by laying out some conclusions that I had reached, and I can go back to a tremendous Russia Today article that appeared last week and that we talked about on last week's show, in which the challenges confronting TEPCO or whoever attempts it to remove the spent fuel rods from Building 4 were laid out. Now, the cranes which used to do that and the computers which used to judge to control the distances between the rods, which have been partially, as I understand, burned already. Their zirconium cladding is gone. Those operations now will have to be performed by human beings operating a crane which is not there yet, and the rods cannot come in contact with each other, which would result in an uncontrolled fission reaction. The challenges are enormous for that. So I would start by asking you a two-part question. Number one, it's my take that everybody in the world understands that those rods have to come out because Building 4 certainly and Building 3 are going to come down very soon anyway. They're being undermined. And assuming the urgency of that, what would be the consequences of an open-air fission reaction?
Well, it's quite complex, really. Several things have occurred recently. It seems like the 4 reactor buildings, 1, 2, 3, and 4, are now sort of standing on liquefied mud, because what happened, and I read this in the Wall Street Journal recently, was there was a river that ran through the area on which Fukushima was built.
Yes.
So they diverted the river to build the reactors. Well, you can't divert rivers because they tend to go back to their natural course. So there's an enormous amount of water moving down from the mountains through that, I suppose, underground river now, underneath the reactors. And because we think that one or several of those three molten cores, each weighing 100 tons and each being incredibly radioactive, may have melted their way through the floor of the containment, which is 6 inches of concrete and steel, into the earth, means that the water submerging these cores, if it is becoming extraordinarily radioactive.
Mm-hmm.
And so the solidity of the ground on which these 4 reactors were built is losing ground. Well, that's a silly thing to say, but it's not stable anymore. That's what they're saying.
Mm-hmm.
So therefore, if there's another earthquake, and there are earthquakes there all the time, little ones, but if there's another one greater than 7, it is fairly sure, they say, that building 4 could collapse because it was severely damaged and the walls buckled during the first earthquake.
Right.
And on top of building 4, as you said, is this cooling pool that stands 100 feet above the ground, containing over 100 tons of extraordinarily radioactive material, which was removed just before the earthquake occurred from the reactor. So it's fresh fuel virtually. It's cooled down a little, that's all. And if that fell to the ground, as you said, well, it would release 10 times more cesium than was released at Chernobyl, and a huge amount of radioactivity, because the fuel rods would burn, the zirconium cladding of the fuel rods would burn if exposed to air, because it would lose its cooling water and it would be exposed to air. They're talking about having to evacuate 35 million people from Tokyo, and that's now becoming more of a discourse within Japan,
mm-hmm.
not so much internationally.
Doesn't it follow that all 7 billion of us should have an immediate priority to safely shut down every reactor on the planet as quickly as possible?
Absolutely correct. Every reactor should be shut down tomorrow, and every coal-fired plant should be shut down tomorrow, because we're threatened from 3 things, really. The ever-present risk of nuclear war, which could happen tonight by computer error.
Mm-hmm.
1,000 people are hacking into the Pentagon every day. It could number 1, nuclear war. Number 2, nuclear power plants. Even if none of them melt down or have accidents like this, the amount of radioactive waste that has accrued, 70,000 tons in America, it must be isolated from the ecosphere for 1 million years, according to the EPA. You can't do that. No container lasts longer than 100 years, if not less. And the radioactive waste will leak into our water supplies throughout the world, in Russia, in France, in Europe, in America, in Canada, all over the place.
We already have that happening at Hanford, yes.
Yeah, that's right. And Savannah River concentrate in the food chain. You can imagine generations hence waking up in the morning. The breast milk was already radioactive. The babies are being born deformed, and I could talk about that at length. The deformed babies being born near Chernobyl. Extraordinary. The babies already getting or having genetic disease, and there are now 6,000 genetic diseases, all of which will be increased by radiation, like diabetes, cystic fibrosis, and the like. Children getting cancer at the age of 6 instead of 60 because they're exposed to radiation in utero and in their breast milk and their food. That's the legacy. That's the legacy that the nuclear physicists have left our descendants. That's what they're going to inherit. And, you know, the men in the Manhattan Project, Oppenheimer et al., they knew at the time what this meant. They knew. And when Oppenheimer watched the first bomb explode, Trinity, he said, for the first time, physicists have known sin, and they've been sinning ever since.
Pretty sobering.
Yeah, remind me to not invite Helen Caldicott to my next dinner party.
Yeah.
That was pretty heavy stuff.
Yeah, she's devoted her life to bringing awareness around this, and unfortunately now the awareness that we're needing to bring to the population is that we are teetering on the brink. It's not if, it's just simply when. And learning to live with that, modifying what we choose to eat or not eat. You know, the rain we had here the other day, I was so pleased and delighted, and I was alternating between joy and leaping about and then going, every one of these raindrops is radioactive. And then I kind of like, and then so this is one of the things that I think is very critical at this time, Martin. For you and I, and for anyone else, to be able to hold simultaneously these really intense devastations. Near-term human extinction is not something that's easily looked at. At the same time that we can fully be in the joy of life, the appreciation of beauty, the great, the belly laughs, which I know you're known for causing people to have.
Well, thank you. It's definitely can be daunting when you pay attention to the world of energy. I mean, without Fukushima even being part of the picture. And so it is really important for people to find balance, and I think that's the lesson we get from nature and the lesson living on this planet is balance is really important. And so be aware of what's happening with Fukushima, but make sure that you balance it with lively times and stay positive, because we haven't had the calamity that people are worried about yet. We do know that there's a plume of radioactive water that is headed towards the West Coast. It's expected sometime next spring to begin arriving. And for some people, the time that has elapsed since Fukushima happened and the earthquake and tsunami has made them feel as though there's nothing that's headed our way. It's already, the threat has passed. But it's true that the initial radiation releases into the air were here on the West Coast within days, but it's been well known that the ocean currents are going to take about 3 years to stir all of this radioactivity towards the West Coast. There's a lot of computer modeling happening all around the world. Different countries, different scientists are trying to predict what's going to happen with the water, but at the same time, people are also learning to look up and think about what's going to be coming into the air if indeed something happens with these fuel rods. And again, there's more than 1,500 fuel rods 100 feet up in the air just at nuclear reactor number 4. Those need to be removed immediately, and you cannot make a single mistake. So 1,500 times in a row, carefully and delicately, without making a mistake. They're expecting it's going to take years for this to happen. And so the awareness is going to be there that every day, is this going to be a safe day over at Fukushima? And oddly enough, I was thinking about this today in advance of this program, and I thought, wow, I wonder how many individuals are going to be personally responsible for operating the cranes that lift and move these dangerous fuel rods. How many people are in charge of the future of humanity? It could just be a few dozen people that are actually going to be in charge of this, or several hundred actually, and more, thousands as they rotate them through. That's the other issue here, is that the location itself is still so radioactive that it's just a challenge to do anything there.
Right.
So
yeah, and I've heard, I think you mentioned it in the clip we're going to listen to in a little bit, that the human workers, and again, that room for that margin of error increases, can't work longer than 20 minutes at a time. Wow.
Yeah.
That's, I mean, I don't think you can even move one of those in its entirety from the beginning of the process through to the completion of moving it in 20 minutes. So we're going to have like one operator who starts moving one of these MOX fuel rods, and then in the middle of moving it, hanging on the crane, we're going to shift to a new operator. I mean, it just is like, wow, really, guys?
It sounds unbelievable, and if someone was telling me that this was happening on another planet, I'd go, wow, I really wish them luck. But and
us.
When I've spoken to my teenage son briefly about it, he actually was a little bit excited because his generation has been raised on calamity movies, and the excitement of some sort of catastrophe that's impending, but there's always a good ending with that. And so I think really what people should be aware of is if you wanted to feel like you could do anything as far as an action to help deal with this predicament, is continuing to raise the call to your politicians and any representatives that we would like some sort of international effort. And if you think about it, this is an accident that's happened in a sovereign nation's property. And the rest of the world just can't go barreling in. Just like if we had some sort of accident in the middle of Kansas and a bunch of nations around the world said, we can clean it up better, they can't just come flying into our borders and land and do what they want. So it's really this delicate issue of leaving it up to Japan, who is leaving it up to this utility company, And the results, though, could impact everyone. Yeah. And so we all just have to sit here and hope that, well, if TEPCO is going to be the one doing the job, then let's hope they've got the best people working it. And again, the timetable right now that's being talked about is November.
To start moving the rods.
Yes, there hasn't been a certain day set, but folks should know that the thousands of workers are getting ready, they're beginning to construct the cranes, and in November, that's when they're going to start this slow, delicate process of moving more than 1,500 fuel rods while they're still encased in water off of this huge structure down onto the ground, and we have to hope that the Earth isn't going to beat us to that deadline.
Right. There's definitely a time crunch factor in this. Well, one of the stress management techniques that I've adopted in my life, because there's a lot of stress. You might have noticed there's a lot of stress out there, folks. And really, there's no way to quite get away from it. Now, I'm going to really make myself look totally stupid on television here. But this is one that works. And this is how you do it. And Martin, you could be a good buddy and get into this with me. And I'm actually inviting all of you out there who are watching to engage with me in this process. This is called the lip flap, and it involves 3 deep breaths and 3 full exhales, where you let your lips flap easily. Now, if you can't get those lips to flap, that means you're really stressed. And your facial muscles are really, really tight. So here we go. Exhale. Inhale. Again. And theoretically, you do it a 3rd time, but I'm not going to make myself look that stupid tonight. 3 of those in a row, full deep breaths, opens up the muscles. If you can't make those lips flap perfectly loose all the way out on that out breath, then you know you need to be doing this. I do it at stoplights. I do it before important phone calls. I do it when suddenly I think about my grandson, who's probably going to die before I do because of his delicate lung condition. It's a tough world. So adopt the lip flap. Really, try it. You'll like it.
The Fukushima lip flap.
The Fukushima lip flap.
Well, and perhaps they'll be able to encourage the workers that are going to be dealing with this to do that. They're going to need all the stress
reduction
relief that they can.
Yes.
Yeah, exactly. And it's interesting, some of the clips, we listened to them talk about the impact on the food chain, and you touched on that. And I have been a seafooditarian for a while now. I don't eat chicken or fowl or red meat, that type of thing. I eat seafood for a lot of my protein needs. I can't eat nuts. So I go to seafood, and as I've been reading more and more about this and the plume of radioactive water filling the Pacific Ocean, I've been wondering if it's time for me to strategically switch, because I don't know if I can trust the reporting on the seafood that I'm eating. Where is it coming from?
Right.
How safe is it? And it's funny to actually think about, this is what it would take for me to switch my eating habits. Is it going to be safer to stay away from seafood and instead find alternative sources of protein? And it's, for me, it ends up being the lesser of 2 evils. But if you do eat seafood, it's going to be something to pay attention to, because
Definitely.
the Pacific Ocean fish are swimming through this. And we all know that the food chain is something where the concentration starts small with the small creatures, and then it bioaccumulates as more and more creatures get eaten, and then us at the top.
And salmon is one that's close up that we eat, and it's going to have a very high accumulation. Unfortunately, the krill population is down already, and krill are more susceptible at the lowest level to the radiation. We already have lost 90% of our large fish in the oceans, the ocean acidification. I mean, we could go on and on. There's a lot of issues here. So pushing some of those already existent, delicate, ecological, and food chain related issues over the edge, this Fukushima radiation situation could definitely do that. I wanted to mention something that I don't have a clip of, actually, at the moment. But for those of you out there watching who have ever tuned into Bill Maher, I happened to catch his show on the 13th, of this month, September 2013. And he had one Edwin Lyman, who's a senior scientist for the Union of Concerned Scientists, speaking about Fukushima. And Bill Maher just handled the situation with great humor, which is one of those things that we somehow have to nurture and cultivate at this time. Go and find that somewhere and take a look. It was quite interesting. And also, we're going to pop into our next clip now. This is Carolyn Baker, again coming from Mike Ruppert's Lifeboat Hour. And she touches on something that is really hard to look at. So let's go ahead and listen to Carolyn Baker on the Lifeboat Hour.
And in the meantime, for me, yes, being consumed by what's going on at Fukushima, I can only look at what's happening hour to hour to our entire planet, because it's affecting so much, not just the Pacific, but on a world basis, on a global basis, everyone and no one, relatively speaking, no one is talking about this. We know that no governments are talking about this. We know that the Japanese government lies about it. We know that TEPCO's ridiculous. Right. And that this is something that is going to cause our collapse. At the rate it's going, pretty quickly, you know, and coming in November with moving the rods from Building 4. So I find it interesting that people who are informed about, you know, life issues, political issues, still aren't talking about this as if we have time.
Well, I think it's still really hard for people to get their minds and their hearts around the fact that we're in hospice. And there's a huge denial of death. This is happening very, very quickly. We don't have time, and we need to stop talking as if we do. And I think that's part of the issue, is this denial of death, as if, you know, we've got all this time. And so when we talk about near-term extinction as possibly being 2030, according to Guy McPherson's research, you know, maybe we should be talking about nearer-term extinction, which is a lot sooner than that.
Well, between one thing and another, near-term human extinction is a very real possibility. Thanks for breathing into this program, and thanks for doing your own research on this. Martin, thank you for being with us. We're not done with the show yet. Carolyn brings up a point that we are all in hospice now. And a couple of years ago, this hit me. It's like, doesn't matter how old or young any of us are, we're all basically facing death in a way that the human species has not had to do before. Nor has the human species, up until very recently in this last century, been able to look out into space with the Hubble telescope to have this great body of knowledge about where we are in the universe and what is so. This incredible time that we're alive. This ability to sit here and talk about the fact that we may be facing near-term human extinction.
Indeed.
I mean, that's like an amazing consciousness factor.
Yeah, the picture of the planet that humanity got for the first time from space, I think temporarily really helped people feel together and feel like they were one. You know, we're so used to fighting each other, and everyone's been aware that eventually what it will take to get all of humanity together is some sort of common threat. And the hope is that humanity will get together and address the Fukushima issue before it really becomes a threat. But it's true, this is something that is going to affect young and old, and everyone, regardless of where you are in your life, may be having to confront some real hard realities as far as life on the planet. And as you've touched on, there's a lot of things already going on, regardless of Fukushima, threatening life on the planet. Extinction rates and climate change and just the unsustainability of our Western lifestyle that's the envy of everyone else and is slowly being adopted by everybody else. But it's very intriguing, the whole concept of hospice and using that to help deal with our planetary crisis that we have here.
Holding more compassion for each other, creating safe space to feel the grief. I mean, there's a lot of grief. We're all grieving something. So becoming good listeners, mitigating suffering where we can, in small ways in our daily life. You know,
not being in denial.
Not being in denial.
Not feeling helpless. You know, there is some power to daily actions, and you know that's something that in my energy work and now with Fukushima, people feel like, well, what can one person do? There's nothing that one person can do. My actions are really meaningless on a global scale. And one of the best analogies that I've been able to make, and actually I heard this from an old civil rights activist back in the 60s, and they said that type of attitude would lead somebody to come across a burning house with a squirt bottle of water, squirt that water, and conclude that water doesn't put out fire. When what you really needed was just more of that, consistently in the same direction. And so for me, I really try and think of natural metaphors and analogies that I could use to help me really look at this situation differently, feel more empowered. You know, you could have a river rock and you could take a bucket of water and throw it against that rock and nothing's going to change. Take a whole bunch of drops of water moving in the same direction long enough over time, you're going to see that rock change. And so people should feel aware to begin with, but then feel compelled to action and compassion. And you know, there's some concern right now on a global scale that if all of humanity really knew the threat we were facing, there'd be mass panic.
And that is very likely to be true.
Some people are saying that's why there isn't really that awareness, because, hey, everyone, shh, don't get everyone freaked out and scared. We don't want everyone fleeing the West Coast, heading to the Southern Hemisphere. And in my research of the Fukushima issue, Helen Caldicott has said that if some sort of fire or explosion happens with this delicate operation of moving the fuel rods, she lives in Boston, she's going to take her family instantly to the Southern Hemisphere because of the winds and the water currents stay a little bit separated. So very bizarre to be thinking about all this, but at the same time to drive around realizing that most folks are totally unaware of the threat that we're facing right now because of earthquake and the liquefaction of the ground underneath, but then also the 1,500 fuel rods that have to be carefully moved one at a time.
One at a time.
Boy.
Well, just that little tone of voice and the roll of the eyes, even though I didn't see the roll of the eyes when I was listening to you on the radio, reminds me of kind of the tone that your clip from a couple of weeks ago was all about. So I think we're going to take a look at that. Just want to let those people out there know that Martin did an incredible job of tying so many of the things that these other clips that we've listened to today have touched on. So let's go ahead and take a look at this clip from Martin Webb's Energy Report this month.
Okay, now for the warm, fuzzy news. God, how to break this to you guys. You know about Fukushima, don't you, or do you? I mean, you certainly heard about the accident yesterday, 2.5 years exactly to the day that the triple event happened, the earthquake, tsunami, and nuclear meltdown. There's been a lot of extra awareness lately about radiation levels in the water along the West Coast increasing. They don't think they're going to be at dangerous levels because it's going to be so well diluted, but they're saying that while the airborne radiation arrived on the West Coast within days of the accident 2.5 years ago, that they knew it was going to take about 3 years based on ocean current modeling for the radiation plume to inundate the West Coast. So by next spring and summer in the swimming season, there'll probably be a lot of news about what the radiation levels on the beaches are. So a lot of discussion about the radiation in the water, not so much knowledge about just how freaking serious the situation is there. There's 1,535 fuel rods, which is 460 tons of nuclear fuel. And if that fuel gets too hot because they can't keep it cool, or it's exposed to the air, or if any of them touch each other or are broken, then there will be nuclear radioactive meltdown and destruction of unheard of level here on the planet. And you might be saying, well, okay, yeah, great. So they're going to move them very carefully. Okay, here's how that works. Let me explain to you. So normally there are cranes, very expensive equipment, computer-controlled, down to the minute detail. They can exactly pick up the fuel rods. They know where every single one of them are. Pick them up, carefully move them, and transport them. That's how it's done all around the planet, except all of that was destroyed at Fukushima. None of that equipment is there. So What they're going to have to do is unprecedented. They're going to have to build equipment on site, cranes that will be handled by humans, so larger margin of error. They will have to carefully lift out these 600-pound rods that are quite long, tens of meters long, and they have to carefully lift them out and put them someplace. This has to be done while they're inside of casks as well in order to keep them cool. And they have to hope that they don't make any mistake, no human error, no equipment failure, and the humans doing all of this can only work extremely short shifts, sometimes as short as 20 minutes because the radiation is so high. They have to do that 1,500 times in a row without making a single mistake, or that we're going to have serious problems. So this is out of the Asia Pacific Journal. This is not just about water. This is not just about radioactive water pouring into the ocean, radioactive water hitting the West Coast. Without downplaying the seriousness of the contaminated water and the other setbacks at Fukushima Daiichi, it is important to recognize that things could get very easily and very quickly get much worse. Understandably, most commentary on Fukushima focuses on the multiple leaks of water laced with high and low-level radiation, but oncoming challenges are far more serious. As Robert Alvarez, former senior policy advisor at the U.S. Department of Energy and one of the world's top spent fuel pools experts, has warned, sites such as Fukushima have, quote, generated some of the largest concentrations of radioactivity on the planet. They need to be handled by the most competent and best equipped expertise available. But sit down and take a deep breath, because starting in November, TEPCO plans to begin the delicate operation of removing spent fuel from reactor number 4 fuel pool. In respect, this is going to be the easiest of the cluster. Even so, there are 1,533 used fuel rod assemblies tightly packed together in the spent fuel pool above the reactor. They weigh a total of 400 tons and contain radiation equivalent to 14,000 times the amount released by the Hiroshima atomic bomb. This spent fuel pool is not sitting comfortably in the ground. It's standing 18 meters above ground. Do the math. That's more than 50 feet. That pool that's 50 feet above the ground was damaged by the earthquake and tsunami and is in a deteriorating condition. It remains vulnerable to any further shocks and is also at risk from ground liquefaction. It's unstable underneath. One might add there's a significant terrorist threat considering the damage that could be done with a light plane or some similar attack. Removing the spent fuel from number 4 and the other pools is clearly an urgent task, but must be done properly. Even under ordinary circumstances, spent fuel removal is a difficult task, normally requiring the aid of computers. But due to the damage, removal of the total of 6,840 spent fuel bundles from the fuel pool and 5 other reactors will have to be done manually. This work will be undertaken under arduous conditions, increasing the risk of yet another mishap. And if something does go wrong, the consequences could be far more severe than any nuclear accident the world has ever seen. If a fuel rod is dropped, breaks, or becomes entangled while being removed, possible worst-case scenarios including a big explosion, a meltdown in the pool, or a large fire. Any of these situations could lead to massive releases of deadly radionuclides into the atmosphere, putting much of Japan, including Tokyo and Yokohama and even neighboring countries, at serious risk. When the stakes are this high, who do you want to bet on? TEPCO's track record is abysmal. They've done nothing to indicate they can be trusted with handling this difficult task. Even now, there are few signs that TEPCO has fully understood the magnitude of the situation they and we as a planet collectively face.
That's a pretty sobering little animation at the end of that clip. Martin, I had to tack that onto the end of yours because it really kind of sums it up. We are like bracing.
If you're on the West Coast, it's scary because we're getting it from the water shortly in a matter of months, if not weeks. And then there's this more urgent threat from the removal of the rods. But yeah, the enormity of the situation is complicated by the fact that we've never experienced anything like this before. Right. Computer modeling is what it is, and we're really all stepping into the unknown together. So it's going to be important for us to keep our hopes up, but also not be naive about the challenges that we face. And that last clip, that's a simulation of the radioactivity that's being modeled that's headed right towards the West Coast. And for a lot of people...
Water.
Yeah, the water.
That was the water.
Yeah, that's radioactive water plume. And of course, the currents are something that shift and change, and they're doing their best, but inevitably that water is headed here to the West Coast. And for me, the water story is what led me into the fuel rods. And so there's a lot of discussion about the water, but yeah, everyone should really be aware that the clock is ticking, and that the hope is that TEPCO in Japan will stop before they start this process and carefully reach out to the rest of the world and find out who should be involved in this. And if there's anything that individuals can do, it's to continue to try and sign the various online petitions, call your Congress people and encourage them.
Keep the pressure on.
One of the websites that I occasionally look at is FukushimaUpdate.com. There's a Fukushima Diary, there's a whole bunch of them.
And in fact, that's a perfect lead-in, because I do have a little compilation of URLs that people can go to on the web, and we're going to go to that in just a moment, but I want to thank you, Martin. We're out of time.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for coming and being here to talk about this very difficult topic. Keep the humor up, okay?
Yeah, you have to. And let's hope that all of this nervousness and worry is for nothing.
That would be nice.
That would be the great outcome. It's rare that we hope that we're wrong. Let's hope we're wrong.
So on that note, wherever I'm looking, there we go. Here are some websites that you can take a look at, and thank you so much for joining me. We will see you next time at the Fuki Cafe.
There must have been a point at the very beginning where we could have said no.